Welcome to our conversation today on disrupting the system, a new approach to preventing and responding to sexual harassment in the workplace. It's so wonderful to have everyone coming into the webinar. We're delighted today that we have over 450 people from across our Male Champions of Change community participating. My name's Liz Broderick and I'm going to be moderating our discussion today. So I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and to recognise their continuing connection to land, to waters and culture. Today, I'm joining you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Can I also acknowledge today any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining the briefings? I also want to acknowledge all those on our call who've been impacted by sexual harassment, those who've been subjected to this behaviour, those who've taken action or spoken out, and those who've supported women and men to once again believe that work is a safe place. We've witnessed significant interest over the last month in the issue of sexual harassment. And I think that speaks to the complexity of preventing and managing sexual harassment. It also speaks to an acknowledgement that what we've done in the past, however well-intentioned, has not worked. And finally, I think it's evidence of a strong desire by so many of us to find a better way. Workplace sexual harassment is deeply personal for many. It's also personal for me. 6 years ago, I first told my own story of being sexually harassed as a young lawyer. That was 25 years after the events, and it was the first time I'd ever told my story in public. I didn't share it because it was more important than anyone else's, or because I wanted or needed any action. I shared it because the features that underpin my story underpin all stories of sexual harassment. A power imbalance, fear, embarrassment and shame, an inability to make a formal complaint. I stopped enjoying a job that I otherwise loved. But fortunately for me, I had a positive outcome through the intervention of caring bystanders, and we'll hear more about that today, who witnessed the behaviour and spoke out. But one of the reasons I told my story was that I wanted others to know that telling your own story in your own words at a time of your choosing is part of a process of healing. It's also part of a process of educating individuals, organisations and nations about what must shift if we're to prevent sexual harassment occurring. And that's why I'm so excited today to be launching this new resource, because at its heart is the ability for individuals impacted by sexual harassment to tell their own story in their own words at a time of their choosing. That will be their gift to us, so that every one of us, everyone on this webinar who cares about prevention can take strong steps to ensure that that never happens again. There is no guide or approach that can help remove the complexity of the human interactions that underpin sexual harassment, nor the power imbalances. They are a result of a gender inequality that's evident today. The media reporting, as you will have noticed, is becoming increasingly polarised. And maybe that's because of a desire to simplify what's an extremely complex structural and human problem. Any attempt to remove complexity will, I believe, leave us with a more polarised environment, where we're seeing women as victims rather than as valued workplace participants with autonomy and agency, where we're seeing men only as perpetrators with never a chance to learn and change. We're asked regularly, do you stand with those who have been sexually harassed, or do you stand with perpetrators of sexual misconduct? It's one or the other. Do you stand with us or do you stand with them? And of course, we stand with everyone's right to be free from any form of violence and harassment in the workplace. But it's up to every one of us, each of us who understand the complexity of preventing sexual harassment, to show that what's needed is a new and disruptive approach, one where dignity and respect lies at the heart, one where the human dimension is once again infused into and central to our response. Because the world is changing, and so too are workplace dynamics. There are many who are nostalgic for the old days when there was clarity about men and women's roles, when sexual harassment was part of the game. And some have suggested that in these changing times, caution will become the emerging script for workplace engagement. That men fearful of being unfairly accused will pull back their sponsorship. They'll pull back their friendship and relationships with women. I hope not, because it's human decency that we're striving for. Human decency is the currency of all workplace interactions. You can't legislate for human decency, and our new approach cannot mandate it. But what we can provide is some signposts and some guidance along the way. So today's a wonderful opportunity to explore in more detail the big disruptive shifts that our new approach proposes. And who better to do that with than our 4 amazing expert panelists. We have Kate Jenkins with us today, you'll know as Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner. We have James Fazzino, who's the convener of the Male Champions of Change National Group, which was established in 2015. We have Amanda Watt, lead partner in industrial relations and employment law at Minter Ellison. And we have Andrew Colvin, who you'll know is a long-standing Male Champion of Change and national coordinator of a national bushfire recovery agency. So I want to thank each of you for being part of our conversation today. But as importantly, I want to thank each one of you for your heroic and tireless efforts to prevent sexual harassment from our workplaces. We're also joined today by many incredible organisations and stakeholders that the Male Champions of Change Institute has worked with to create this report. We are so grateful to have your guidance, your insights and your valuable contributions in the production of this report. And then finally, can I thank every one of our Male Champions of Change organisations, many of you on this call, who are as excited as I am today to showcase a new disruptive approach, because it's your efforts to drive change. It's your adoption, adaptation and implementation of this report that will create the impact that we all so deeply desire. Thank you for your deep engagement and your collaboration with us. So just quickly, before I kick this conversation off, I'll outline how we'll run today, and I'll let you know how you can pose questions to the panel. We will take your questions towards the end of the session. What we will do, we'll try and aggregate similar questions so that we can get through as many as possible. So we're going to have an initial conversation with the panelists, and then I'll be picking up the questions that are coming through on the chat. I should let you know that the conversation will be recorded so that we can share it with others within your organisations who are unable to join us today. And please note that if you need technical assistance during this event, the email address is operations@levelhorizons.com. But I hope today inspires you and your organisation to disrupt the system on sexual harassment. So let's get this conversation going. And I might start with you, James. And I just want to thank you, James, so much for your incredible leadership on this report. I mean, as many in the audience will know, James is a former CEO of Incitec Pivot. He is now the chair of Manufacturing Australia. He sits on various ASX listed boards and is so well regarded in the business community in this country. He's also a long-standing Male Champion of Change, and he took over together with Kate Jenkins, co-convening the National 2015 group. And that's the group that's really been leading on this report. So James, the report describes really 5 big disruptive shifts to better prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. And I know you've spent so much time thinking about it as the report's developed. I was just wondering, were there some big aha moments where things shifted for you that you could share with the webinar today? Thanks, James.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Liz, for the introduction. And actually, I would just firstly like to acknowledge that I'm on Wurundjeri land today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I guess, firstly, the big aha moment, which was quite confronting, was what we've been doing hasn't worked. And that was borne out by the deep dives that we did around MCC, also borne out by Kate's report, Respect at Work. I'll let Kate talk about that. And it's confronting because, of course, these were organisations that I led, organisations that I sit on the boards of, organisations that I represent in industry groups. And it's our people that are being impacted, our primarily women. And so in some respects, it said, look, that's really confronting personally. Let's do something about it. We can't train our way out of it because that hasn't worked. And so what we really need to do is take up the IP of MCC and disrupt the system. So first insight, had to try something different because what we were doing wasn't working. The next one was, actually, this is a health and safety issue. You cannot claim to have a safe workplace if you've got harassment going on. And that actually means it's on senior management's agenda, and it's definitely on boards' agendas, because, you know, the number one requirement of a board is for your people to be safe and for you to have a healthy and safe workplace. And that actually liberated some of the thinking, because if we take a health and safety lens, then our focus is on prevention, early intervention, being driven by the numbers, which means we report, we investigate, we respond fairly and proportionately. So that really does liberate the thinking to say, hey, it's health and safety. And the really good thing about that is there's nothing new we need to create. Health and safety committees already exist in organisations. The cadence of health and safety strategy and reporting already exists. So we can actually buddy up onto that. And then the only other thing was really the absolute need for transparency. Covering it up, having agreements, legal agreements put in place just don't work. They don't work because the organisation already knows it's gone on. So thinking you can cover it up simply just doesn't work. And it prevents women telling their stories, which is crucial for us to learn organisationally, and actually crucial to allow people to feel confident to raise issues so we can deal with them.
Thanks very much,
You're on
James.
mute.
I know I committed the ultimate sin on Zoom, so I'm back live now. But what we might do is move on to Kate, because James, you referred to Kate's report, and Kate's report was just so fundamental in the work that the Male Champions of Change were able to do. So Kate, firstly, congratulations on such an incredible report, Respect at Work, but also your groundbreaking national inquiry into sexual harassment in Australian workplaces. I mean, I feel so proud to live in a country where we've had such a good look at this issue, because there are not many other countries that are doing that. For those of you who aren't aware, Kate established the National Male Champions of Change 2015 group. And as I said before, until recently, Kate was also co-convener of that group with James. In that role, Kate very much encouraged the members of that group to look deeply at the lessons that they were learning from managing through sexual harassment complaints, looking at what was working and what wasn't. And that really became the foundation of a report that we're releasing today. So Kate, just to ask you, in terms of the approach that we're releasing today, I mean, what do you consider to be the most disruptive action, and why do you consider that?
Thank you, Liz. I'm really excited to be here talking about this report, actually. I'll go a few different ways, because some of what I'm interested in is because I was a corporate lawyer like Amanda is. I did those cases for 20 years. I did them in a particular way, as James has said, and I've spent the last sort of 2 years reflecting that with the best intention, some of that has had unintended consequences. In terms of the report, I guess a big picture comment I would make is that there is no question. So the 2015 group will know we had some pretty active and rigorous conversations the minute the Weinstein thing happened. And James, I'm looking at James's face. It was the most impassioned conversation I've had. There were one-on-one, you know, me kind of with a range of men who I still fortunately get on very well with, just about this issue. So that was really the start of what I'm so proud of. Lisa Whiffen in particular has, you know, navigated this through with all of the men being really behind it, particularly Chris Eccles making time to sit down and really learn. So the process of getting to this report and using the insights from the National Inquiry is fantastic. So a couple of comments. One is, I would say what's great about this report in particular is that it has very clearly in mind CEOs, leadership and organisational change. And, you know, I'm pointing to, this is the show copy, but that's a bloody big report. And even though I'd love you to all read chapter 6, the reality is this report takes all that and turns it into something that's actionable, that's practical, that's delivered, that makes so much sense. And every leader and organisation that's had a pre-peek at the report has said how helpful it sort of just completely converts kind of the moment that we're in into things that can be done. So that's the first thing, is just the fact of how well timed and how useful it is. The second is, one of my big recommendations for organisational change is industry action, that this is a systemic problem. It's not a one, you know, there's not one bad bloke in every organisation. It's a systemic problem. And the idea of industry groups, and I know across the Male Champions Coalition there are industry groups in particular, I'd really encourage focus there. But to get 260 organisations to sign up to this, it really creates critical mass, and it really will have its own momentum because of that joint approach. The last thing, I mean, I think it's all good because in lots of ways, I absolutely, you know, everything that's in there is endorsed, and I was very much engaged in the process. So I think the solutions are spot on. But the thing that I won't talk to too much because Amanda can talk to, but the thing I'm most excited about, and that is the most disruptive, and I think the most that will be the most radical, but the very thing that everyone didn't want to do is the thing that you need to do, is the action number 3 about confidentiality and transparency. Having a career and looking through the inquiry of how the laws work to only really act on complaints, the media really report to really bring down reputations of individuals and organisations, and then the incentives in organisations to keep it all quiet, which has left us in this really odd position where we all pretend it doesn't happen because everything is under wraps, when in fact it's actually created the circumstances to continue it. So that one in particular is the one I'm sort of pointing to, because in some ways that wasn't stuff I could write about in the report. No one really wanted to talk to me on the record about it. But through this mechanism, what a great chance for trusted organisations to actually talk about what they knew was a challenge and find a good solution. So I'm looking forward to hearing Amanda talking about that practical thinking of the solutions, because I think that's both going to make lots of people uncomfortable, but will break the damn wall. I really think that's the solution.
Thanks, Kate. And that's a great segue actually through to you, Amanda. I want to introduce Amanda Watt from Minter Ellison. As I said before, Amanda sits on the partnership board, and she's the lead IR and HR partner there in Melbourne for Minter Ellison. And not only that, Amanda, you've been such a strong advocate around sexual harassment. It's been a real passion of yours, and I can't thank you enough for the pro bono work that you've done to ensure that our shift around principles of transparency and confidentiality, which is, as Kate said, are probably the most disruptive part of it, that you've been our guide on that, because those principles are so important. So I'm just wondering, Amanda, Could you help us understand the human and the organisational impact of the current approach, and then just why those principles are just so important?
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Male Champions of Change. It has been such a privilege to be part of this work. So Liz, what I might do is I'll first talk about the principles and then comment on that human and organisational impact of the current approach. So these principles are about our senior leaders, and you can find them on page 44 of the report. And yes, I am very passionate about them because I think they will lead to systemic change, which will prevent sexual harassment in our workplaces. And I will do that if they are applied consistently, because if that happens, they can then build trust in the following outcomes. First, that sexual harassment will not be tolerated. If senior and powerful people engage in sexual harassment and that follows a fair process, they will not be protected, regardless of their status and regardless of their prior commercial performance. And they will understand that their identity and the fact of any payout on departure may also be revealed publicly. And they will understand also, I think, that their interests will not be prioritised over the wellbeing of others, and the duty of care that the organisation owes to its people. I think the second thing that these principles do is people have trust that the organisation will be transparent about the fact that they have sexual harassment complaints, and they will learn from those complaints so that they can prevent sexual harassment. And I think that outcome is going to be maximised by what I hold dear and think is the cornerstone principle, which is after an investigation is concluded, complainants will not be restricted if they choose to tell their story. And I have seen, we just saw it from you, Liz, at the start of this session, I've seen the great power that comes from storytelling, because you see the human impact of the egregious behaviour. And it makes it more likely that an organisation will learn from the experience of complainants so they can prevent sexual harassment. And I think you've also touched on this, it's so important to a complainant's healing that they have the agency over how their story is told. So I think if we can build that trust, then we create psychological and physical safety in our workplaces, and then we can sustain a culture where everyone can bring their best selves to work every day, free from harassment. So you also asked me to touch on the human and organisational impacts of the current approach, which is really about minimising liability and media attention, often at the expense of the wellbeing of others. And it's certainly completely out of step with what the community, stakeholders and regulators expect about responses to sexual harassment today. So I think a byproduct of the current approach is that a sexual harassment complaint will often be received in tandem with a resignation. And with that, the loss of career and the loss of talent, usually female talent, to the organisation. And I think if you're in that scenario, you've got a clear signal that there is no psychological safety. The complainant has not felt heard. She has not got any trust that the conduct will be stopped by the organisation, yet she wants to call out the conduct and bring it to attention so that those that remain in the workplace can be protected from it. So I think that by the time you get a complaint, you've often got a complainant who is at the end of their tether. They are also often got wellbeing, anxiety or depression, and in my experience, they have thought long and hard before they've made a complaint, particularly about a powerful person. Because they just want it to stop, they want their career to not be impacted. And usually also they've seen over the years lots of stories where senior people have engaged in sexual harassment, left the organisation with big payouts and fresh opportunities, when the complainant themselves has often been in the media and finds themselves without employment and potentially having to leave the state and sometimes the country to get another job. So by the time you have a complaint, you've got a massive loss of productivity and creativity from the complainant. And, you know, that's not surprising because it's very hard to be creative and productive when your nervous system is in a constant state of fight or flight. And then just to finish up, I think those impacts reverberate across others in the organisation because they, of course, are watching and waiting to see how the organisation responds and protects them.
Thanks very much, Amanda, and thanks so much for outlining the human cost, because this is happening on our watch, which is another reason every one of us needs to step up with something, an approach that's going to disrupt. And just while you're talking there about culture, I'd like to introduce Andrew Colvin, who everyone on the call will know, but Andrew's been such a long-term supporter of the Male Champions of Change. And I have to say, Andrew, it was really a moment when you addressed the National Press Club, I think a couple of years ago, on national security issues, and you stood up and you said, I'm a proud male champion of change. You know, I believe in the equality of men and women and will do whatever I can to progress this in Australia. It was fantastic. So Andrew, thank you so much for your strong advocacy over many years, but also the approach that you've taken in so many different environments. And now Andrew finds himself leading the National Bushfire Recovery Commission. But many of you will know that when Andrew was the commissioner, the head of the AFP, he took a really strong stance on the issue of respectful and inclusive cultures. And I thought, Andrew, it'd be really interesting just to hear from you about the role of leaders, because I know your leadership absolutely made a difference in that organisation. So what's the role of leaders in preventing sexual harassment in the workplace? And I'd like to hear from the perspective of the head of the organisation, but also from those who are in other leadership positions, because it takes the whole leadership team to move this along. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Liz, and good morning, Phil. Yep, good morning, everybody. It's a real honour and privilege to be asked to talk today, and let me also start by just saying congratulations to the team that pulled this report together, because for those of you that haven't had a chance to look at it yet, it is so practical. The principles, the statements, and the position that the report takes is something that, when I think about the journey that I've been on, had I had those really practical ideas at the very start, then it would have been such a benefit. So well done to the team, and particularly from that disruptive impact as well. And Liz, that really gets to, I guess, you know, my takeaways around leadership. When I started to look into these issues within my organisation and to start this journey, I quickly came across what I'm sure many of you on the webinar today will, where you'll find that you've got lots of procedures and practices and guidelines that are very strong and robust and say that as an organisation we don't accept this and this is how we deal with it. And as I looked across the AFP, I could find over the previous 35 to 40 years multiple times that we had attempted as an organisation to address the issues, to address culture, to address diversity and inclusion, and the symptoms that come from that poor culture being sexual harassment, but we never did anything about it. We attempted to call it out, we looked at it, but we never actually stood up and were made accountable for it. So that was the position that I took, and it was probably the most disruptive thing I did, and frankly the most uncomfortable, was to actually stand up and be accounted for it. And I've told the story many times that within my organisation I had a lot of negative feedback at first about that, because I was so public about the fact that we had issues that we needed to address. And over time that changed, and the organisation became much more accustomed to the fact that no, this is an issue we need to deal with. But it really started with me as the head of the organisation, firstly accepting that this was an issue within the organisation, accepting that as someone who'd been in the organisation for nearly 30 years, that I was in some way a part of it as much as anybody else was, and that unlike previous efforts to address poor culture or behaviour, I was going to be personally accountable. So it wasn't a lot of fun addressing the national media about the work that we were doing, or standing up at the National Press Club and talking about it, but it was so critically important for the organisation and for those outside the organisation to hold me and the organisation to account. But of course, I was only one person, and to this day, these are challenging issues for a big organisation. And leadership across the organisation has to step up and be right there with the CEO. And because as soon as the organisation looks up and sees any wavering or any cracks or any divergence of views, then it starts to put in people's minds again that here we are, nothing is going to change again. They're not serious about it. It's just words, they're not genuine. And that was the biggest challenge I think that I had, and I think all organisations have, is to convince your organisations that notwithstanding their own personal experience for 10, 20, 30 or more years, somehow this is going to be different and you are going to be accountable. So that was really important for me, Liz, to do that within the organisation. I had many aha moments along that journey. And you know, one of them, and we've talked about already, was what does the victim want? How should we treat the victim? In policing, I came to the realisation that we had long ago changed the way we dealt with victims of sexual assault or assault in the public arena and put them at the centre of our thinking, but we hadn't caught up internally in our own organisations, and we were re-victimising people time and time again. We were creating second tiers of victims by bystanders coming forward, effectively becoming victims as well. And we just needed to change that, and that took a very strong public profile, I guess, and narrative to do that.
Thanks, Andrew. And putting the individual impacted at the centre of a response, it's a really big shift, as you say. But just maybe coming quickly to you, Kate, and we've got a few questions coming through as well. But Kate, one of the things that your inquiry and we've found also with the this resource that we're launching is that bystander intervention is one of the main opportunities to reduce sexual harassment. And I know that your report or your inquiry found that most of the sexual harassment is often between co-workers as well. So just wonder whether you could talk a little bit about what that opportunity is for all of us.
Yes, and one of my that came up a lot. So across the country, it's very Australian, and particularly in the legal sector, actually. So there's been this recent focus on the legal industry because of the reporting about sexual harassment in the High Court. And I have been interested how people sort of have suddenly said, oh, bystander training, if we could just get everyone else to sort each other out, then that would really solve the problem. So I guess the first thing I would say to a Male Champions Change audience is do not misunderstand bystander activism or involvement or education is about cultural change, but it's not an abrogation for leadership. And in lots of ways, some of the times when we're talking about bystander training, we're really talking about men who don't know what to do, and often men who are in leadership roles. So there are a couple of focus groups I did that involved organisations in the Male Champions group because of the support that I had for the inquiry. And there was a conversation with one group of male managers, and it was only men. And I remember this conversation because it was a light bulb for me. So at some point they said, okay, we're really keen to know. First thing was their sort of sense of what's appropriate and inappropriate. So one of the principles, I think number 4 is about this, is it okay or not? How do I know what's welcome, what's unwelcome? And then if I think it is unacceptable, do I speak to her? Do I speak to him? Do I speak at the time? Do I speak, like this guy is shooting all the things that it is making his head go dizzy. And so what we found in the inquiry, so what I realized, what we know about bystanders is, 1, they need to know what's okay and not okay. So they need to know when to act. And 2, then they need to know what they can do. And in the absence of that, it's all, and as Andrew said, in fact, bystanders can suffer the same wrath as a victim. If you speak up, or same power plays at play. So my sense about bystanders and the conversation is, there's 2 things that I think is really interesting. One is making sure that any bystander education is not done at the expense of actually managers and leaders doing their job. But that education, we found, the research showed us, actually has better effect than some straight, what they call prohibitive education. So prohibitive education, we've all done it. I've designed a million, I've delivered it. This is what sexual harassment is. this is what will happen if you do it. So this is the consequences, and this is how you complain. And if something happens, you have to complain, because we can't do anything if you don't complain. So that prohibitive, you know, like we're telling you to do it, not to do it, and then you'll get in trouble if you do it. So we all know that. And we've 20 years of this. We've been doing it once every 2 years. We, you know, online now. But someone pointed out recently, like I've been told numerous times about how much exercise I should do, how I should eat better. And surprise, surprise, it has no impact on my exercise or my eating better. What they've found is, though, bystander training, where people aren't being sort of so confronted but explained what they can do in an active way, particularly for men, is more effective. So if a man goes into sexual harassment training, the research tells us that they feel like you're accusing them of sexual harassment. So they get their backs up a bit. Women, not so much. Women say, great, I'm glad the men have finally heard this, but the men, not so much. So there's some really interesting bystander training. But my other thing is looking at manager and leadership training, that I think some of the bystander conversations confusing from what you're really sometimes asking is better line leaders. CEOs, of course, important, but the line leadership. So in our inquiry, we absolutely heard the best workplaces. So I ask quite regularly, okay, you've had a good workplace, what were the hallmarks? And it was never that there was a good policy. Not one person said, my workplace has a great policy, but they regularly said, I know my line leader, I'm comfortable with them. I know I can talk to them. I know their position on this stuff. And I know if something goes wrong, I'm safe to speak up. And so the bystander stuff I'm really interested in, but I'm also interested in different ways, if that's sort of an indirect answer. But I think it's the fourth principle about empowering people to know what's going on. That's what that's getting at.
Thanks, Kate. And just, talking about leadership, and also maybe James around accountability. It's all very well to have a strong, disruptive and detailed approach, because as Andrew said and Kate said, just the level of tangible advice and policies and things that are in the report are just so very important. But in terms of its adoption by the Male Champions Change organisations, I've had some feedback or doing media interviews, and I've been asked, well, where is the formal commitment? How are they taking it on? I mean, do you think it's a reasonable concern, James?
Yeah, I do, Liz. I mean, I think it is a reasonable concern. Look, firstly, following the AMP and QBE headlines, if you're a Male Champions to Change and you think this is not on your agenda, you're really sadly mistaken. And I've had 3 boards, as you say, that I've sat on. It's been on the agenda of every board, and quite rightly, actually, investors have put it on board's agenda, and that's been some real leadership. But look, these things are never paint by numbers. Organisations are complex. We're actually saying you need to disrupt the system in your organisation. And so, like everything else we do in Male Champions of Change, individual members will decide on the pace of change. But, my concept is this is on your agenda. You've got a really practical guide. You do need to do something about it.
Thanks, James. Maybe a question for Amanda that's come through here. Amanda, can you point to examples where transparency in sexual harassment cases has worked well? It's been a positive.
Yes, of course, because it gives people the confidence and that psychological safety that something will be done about it. That's the key to it, I think.
Right. Thanks for that. Just coming, Andrew, I'm just wondering, you talked, and I know you've done a lot around culture change. You've done a lot about encouraging mindset shifts, because at the heart of sexual harassment is creating a culture which is safe and healthy, respectful. Those things can be a slow process. I mean, have you seen anything in your experience that could speed that process up?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. And I think that's it's so true. I mean, we're talking about sexual harassment today, and I see one of the questions is about broader harassment or bullying. While they're different, and sexual harassment gets a lot of attention rightly because it's so egregious. The reality is all those forms of harassment and bullying are a product of poor culture. They're a product of behaviours that have been allowed to sit in an organisation for too long. They're a product of lack of diversity and inclusion and respect. So I think you have to focus on that culture if you really want to get at the problem. What do I see that makes a difference? You have to find those people in the organisation that will champion this. And it can't always be the obvious people. You as a CEO will need to champion it. Your leadership team will need to champion it. But to Kate's point, and I know others have said this as well, if the person in your organisation is looking up and at the first sign of leadership or management in their organisation, they don't see someone who is able to help them with these challenges, then it doesn't really matter what you say as a CEO. So I think the real trick here is how do you, two things. How do you find those people in your organisation that are going to champion this for you? But secondly, and I spent too long worrying about this, you have to shut out the negativity. You have to ignore the fact that there will be a percentage of your organisation, in some cases a large percentage of your organisation, that will try and pull this apart and will try and undermine it because status quo has its own tide that is incredibly strong. You have to shut that out. You have to shut it out and find those pockets in the organisation that are actually going to champion this and drive that if you want to drive that culture reform. But it's a long journey, and it's not even a 2 or 3 year thing. It's not even a 5 year thing. I think it's a 10 and 15 year journey for most of our organisations because poor culture has been so indoctrinated, frankly, in a lot of our organisations.
Thanks very much, Andrew. It's such a great point that this takes courage. I mean, anything in gender equality takes courage, but this particularly does at the minute. And I think particularly given the media landscape and the things also, Amanda, you talked about around reputational, the focus is on protecting reputations, the corporate reputation and other things. So it does take courage for sure. Just one of the questions, Kate, I had for you was just in terms of your report, you actually said that organizations can take a strong stance, which we're absolutely up for and encouraging them to do that. But what's required from other actors? Because one of the things I know just from my own experience in managing some of these things is you've got so many different jurisdictions where people can bring complaints. You've got the media, so trial by media, you've got the Fair Work Commission, everything else in play. It's deeply confusing as a starting point. So just be interesting in your observations on that.
That's a really good point, and that's why sort of over the 18 months, this report is really focusing on organisational role in change. But there's no question that our inquiry found that there is a much bigger picture in the Australian landscape to consider. So our recommendations really hit a number of those areas. And if I just do a really quick big picture, because even though I showed you the big version, the small version I'd highly recommend for people who love this report so much that they want to read more. But the big kind of areas, because our recommendations were to organisations, but our organisational recommendations were much more flexible, and this report really helps fill what that would be. But firstly, we looked at the data that exists. So we do have good research in Australia, but there are definitely gaps about things that people really want to know, including about the costs. So we did get that assessment by Deloitte Access Economics, which is a member of the group, of the 3.8 billion in 2018. So we learnt the cost, but so the data, there were recommendations about government and other organisations being able to collect data, including by industry. So I know the Fire and Emergency Services Group has got a lot of data. So Andrew's been involved with gathering that data. Secondly, we did make recommendations, broader community recommendations. We call them primary prevention, but looking at particularly schools, education, universities, media and broader community campaigns. So I saw there was a question about, well, how do we help SMEs, the small to medium-sized enterprise? And really the message from them was, a billboard at the bus stop is a really helpful message to my workers and the customers who come into my shop. So there's some really proactive, and that they were recommendations for organisations like Our Watch. We definitely made a range of recommendations about the laws. We do have good laws in Australia. We've got the human rights or the discrimination laws, the fair work laws and the safety laws. There are others, but those three, we found actually there's a lot to sort of complement, you know, great things there, but they don't work together. So this group will know, I know members of this group, you know, you sack someone for sexual harassment and then the Fair Work Commission says, no, you've got to bring them back. And they're like, that's not, hang on, over here it says no, and over there you're saying, no, you can't do that. So our recommendations were some amendments to the laws, but also just to make sure we work together. And I'm already working closely with the Fair Work Commission, with Comcare, with a whole range of agencies, because we all want to just kind of be more effective. It'll be more efficient, but it'll also be better. And then we did the workplace, which is very much the focus of the Male Champions report, and also support for individuals. So, you know, Liz, very well, places like the Working Women's Centres do amazing work, like well beyond, I think, what anyone recognises. So we need all those supports there. So that's why the report is quite big. But in terms of organisations, this is on the ground. This is, you know, this is where it's happening. This is where it's unlawful. But some of the legal stuff is, you know, actually to use the legal processes, people don't want to, but even if they did, they almost need, you know, they need to pay whatever Amanda's high price rate is to understand how it all works and, you know, where do I go and am I in the time and were they my boss or were they a contractor? And, you know, it was just, I mean, even I was going, yeah, no wonder no one uses it, because if you decide you want to, you just kind of can't figure it out. You know, very sophisticated lawyers found it really tricky. So we did make broader recommendations, and government's currently considering those, and we expect in the next few months to get a response. But once COVID hit, our report was tabled at the 5th of March, and, you know, Liz, we were proposing to take it to New York and the world, but we ended up all being grounded pretty quickly after that. So what we know is government did have to put the report to one side, but my great encouragement and my great, I've been really impressed about how organisations who had some space to consider this, even though all these things were happening at COVID, including through the Male Champions group, have actually stepped in and said, what can we do? We don't need to wait for government. We know the safety laws are already there. So it's kind of the implementation has flipped, but that's, I think, to the betterment of Australian workers.
Thanks, Kate. And actually, as you're talking about law firms, and I hope everyone is paying Amanda's high price there at Minter Ellison, because she's probably the best you can get. But look, Amanda, just a quick final question to you. Law firms are often called in to advise on cases, particularly involving senior and high profile, powerful people. I just wonder whether the changes that were outlined in our new approach today, are they ones that you'll see easily recommended to clients and potentially adopted?
Yes, thanks, Liz. I certainly hope so. I think lawyers have a wealth of experience in this field to share, and those that are, you know, keen observers of what's going on will have absolutely picked up community sentiment has changed. But I think the really important point I wanted to make is that I think the momentum that's being created by this community shift in expectations, it's really in the hands of the people listening today, because that's where the real power lies. That's because lawyers, two things. We have an ethical obligation to act on our instructions, so that comes from everyone on this call. And we also respond to our commercial market, and that's everyone on this call. So I think everyone here has the power to hold their lawyers to account and to challenge them to really look at these matters through the lens of the new principles in this report. And I think a really great example of how there can be client-driven ripple effects, is what I like to call them, is a decision made by the Victorian government many years ago, which was to say to all its panel firms, I'm going to set you KPIs on pro bono work. And that made an amazing difference to opening up access to the legal system. So I really invite everyone on this call, you know, ask your lawyers to work with you, and they will, I'm sure.
And in fact, just as we go around, and James, I don't know whether you want to add anything to that, but one of the things I was interested in taking up Amanda's point there, because there are people from HR, from communications, legal people, you know, managers, senior leaders on the call today. I mean, if I were to run away from this call and immediately start preparing a new sexual harassment prevention plan, what would you say would be one of the first things they should put on it? Yeah, anyone want to answer that one first? James, sorry.
Yeah, for me, number one, you've got to start with yourself. So you've got to start with leadership, and you've got to set the expectation at zero. So in safety, we said zero harm. In terms of risk, we talk about risk appetite being zero, standard zero. So you set the standard. And then, you know, ideally, use the processes you've already got in the business to actually deal with this, which is why, you know, I think safety is such a good idea, because you've already got safety systems. If your safety systems are less developed, use your risk management systems. So don't reinvent the wheel, and then start to act. And yes, you're going to have to pivot and change as you go through this, but you've got to start somewhere. Of course,
no,
you
just
know,
remember you.
Yep.
Sorry, you go, James.
Yeah, and of course, you actually initially you're going to see the numbers go up, because you're going to discover everything that's happening in the organisation. So you need to set the standard. That's what you'll see. But of course, once we see things that get reported, then the opportunity is to investigate, and then we can put in place prevention. The one thing I would say is what I've learnt is if it gets to the point where it gets on the board's agenda and you've got lawyers, you've well and truly thrown the, you know, you've well and truly got a disaster on your hands. That's exactly why we've got to start, firstly, look at prevention, put in place preventative measures that prevent this from happening, and actually, where we have got it, tackle it when it first occurs. These things never happen in a bubble. All of the people who are the celebrated examples you see in the press, the people have got form. And when you look back, if we had earlier intervened, we wouldn't have had the issue at the end.
Thanks, James. Andrew, on the sexual harassment prevention plan, the new one?
Yep. So I'd say, first of all, don't make it a HR issue. Don't just go to your director HR and say, can you fix this for me? I need a new plan. That's what all of your predecessors have done. All of our predecessors have done for 30 years, made it a HR issue. It's not a HR issue. It's a leadership issue. I like that we are reframing it as a safety issue, because we would not think twice about helping someone with a broken arm. We don't think twice anymore about helping somebody with mental health issues. We see that as a debilitating effect on their workplace. So why do we see this any different? So don't make it a HR issue. Admit it, own it, and don't equivocate in the first sign of barriers. I think James's point just before is so true. Be ready that once you start this, the spike will go higher before it gets better. So build that into your planning, build that into your thinking.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Amanda?
Well, Liz, I'm going to invite everyone to please apply the principles on transparency and confidentiality across their organisation, and have a really good look at how you use non-disclosure agreements, particularly protecting the right of complainants to tell their story whenever they choose to do so.
Thanks very much, Amanda. And Kate, I'll pass to you. I also just want to pick up one question, a good question that is coming through on the screen, just about the fact that sexual harassment isn't just directed towards women. We know that there's a growing group of men who are experiencing sexual harassment, often perpetrated by other men, but it's a growing group, and they absolutely need our attention as well. So I'm just wondering, Kate, whether you had any data around that from your recent survey.
We absolutely do, and I saw that question, and we heard during our inquiry the serious effect it has. In fact, there was a point in the inquiry where I did kind of whatever I could do to just say, men, please engage more with the inquiry, because my observation was women were coming to the focus groups, but actually men were victims, men were, you know, 4 out of 5 perpetrators. So the latest survey results were 26% of Australian working men had been sexually harassed in the last 5 years. And that has been a steady increase. I think the previous one under your watch, Liz, was around 16%. So it's sort of been creeping up as well. But men are managers, men are CEOs. There's so many reasons why men should take time to be more informed about this issue. And without doubt, the key driver of sexual harassment is power disparity, but particularly gender inequality. And I also noticed someone, I think it was the same participant, commenting on our use of language. We are talking men and women, but we absolutely recognise non-binary people in this work, and in fact, the higher risk that LGBTI communities also face in terms of sexual harassment. So if I think to your question and sort of bounce off Andrew as well, and people have heard me say, so Andrew said this is a long journey, but my main comment is, well, it's you know, we need to get started. It will be even longer if no one leaves the first. So often people say change takes time, and I just always say change takes action, and I can't see you doing anything different. So that's absolutely the first thing I would say. And I also agree with Andrew's comment of don't lose kind of heart at the first misstep, because there will be missteps, but actually not doing anything is much, much worse. So my comments generally would be, you know, in the bigger picture, engaging more men is really important. So this is the perfect organisation to be talking about that. Confirming Amanda's comments as well, but I would say gathering people together, safety, lawyers, comms, leaders, it's the combination that's got the better answer. My other suggestion is, my strong view is action is really working when you take industry action. It both helps the small players, people move within the same industries, there's the same drivers. So if you come together, yes, you as an organisation can do something, but I would really encourage, even though it might seem hard, for you to think about the broader industry action. But the last point I would say in terms of things for that very top leadership to think about, which is completely consistent with the Male Champions of Change purpose, is that a lot of these things are happening with pretty much mostly men at the wheel. And in the absence of getting more women into leadership roles, I think the mistakes that we're making they're so bloody stupid. Some of these cases that are reported, I think if there'd been one woman in that room, they would have said, oh no, we shouldn't do this. So it's not to say women are smarter than men, but the diversity in that leadership table is critical so you can identify the issues. And on sexual harassment in particular, I will say, and I don't like to do the man versus women, but women generally, their radar on this is much more finely tuned than men who in many cases have never experienced sexual harassment, are confused by it. So I guess my end encouragement is more women through to the top, which is in fact what everyone on this call is working towards, but it's the solution to so many things.
Thanks very much, Kate, and thanks for reminding us about the importance of promoting women's leadership as one of the main preventative issues in this area. We're going to have to wrap up our call now, but I just want to thank each of our expert panelists, not just for their very lively contributions. It's been such a wonderful conversation to our discussion today, but for taking a stand on what I believe is one of the most important issues of our time, because there are points in our working life where we come to recognize that maybe the assumptions we've been making, maybe the way we've operated or managed issues is actually not delivering, that we can no longer justify a particular approach despite all our good intentions. And indeed, that approach is sucking the humanity out of our organizations. And I believe how we've viewed and responded to sexual harassment in the past is one of those such issues. But today I do feel truly optimistic about what this system shift might mean for the respect and dignity of everyone in our workplaces, but also for women's opportunity in the future, for their right to be safe at work, their right to economic independence, and the ability of all of us to better understand the importance of these rights for our economic prosperity, for peace, for justice and sustainable development. And while we absolutely need male leaders like James and Andrew and the other 270 members of our Male Champions of Change coalition stepping up and saying, it's not working, we have to do something different, by itself, that won't be enough. Because what we've heard from all the conversation that we've had today is that every one of us has to play our part, not just the CEO. Every one of us has contributed to a system that's not delivering. The behaviours that we've brushed off as, oh, well, that's just Steve, he's always like that, or the NDAs we've drafted, the exits we've quietly managed, the comms that we've creatively drafted to make the problem go away. Every one of us has contributed to that situation. And that's why this report is so important, because now we know that's not working. We have an alternative approach and a practical blueprint, and now we're going to step up and use it. Because we can't change the past, but we can and we will create a different future. Sexual harassment is preventable. It has no place in our workplaces. It's unthinkable, not inevitable. We're members of a powerful coalition, and I'm so proud and thankful for the disruptive work that we've been able to co-create. So let's consign sexual harassment to the pre-COVID world, in the knowledge that all of us are playing a significant role to make that happen. And in closing, I particularly want to thank Lisa Whiffen, who's stayed with us and been one of the key authors of our report over the last 18 months, James Fazzino and Kate Jenkins, and the 2015 group for really bringing this report together, for doing the thinking behind it, and for creating such a groundbreaking initiative. And I also want to thank Annika Freya, who's the CEO of Male Champions of Change Institute and has been guiding this process every step of the way, and Julie Bisonella for the work that she's done in making sure that this approach is spread far and wide across our country, and for every one of those people bringing it to fruition at a moment when the world is calling out for disruptive and more human approaches. So thanks to everyone who's been part of this picture today. I can't wait to see how this is upended in the future, and I can't wait for every one of the people who are on our webinar participants to be part of that future. So thank you very much.